Last year, I bought an ancient 1/200 scale Yamato model and equipped it with remote control. After some small mishaps that involved waterlogged electronics, it worked. After that first run, I did run the ship a few more times afterwards, but something didn't seem right. The ship was taking on lots of water when it would go on a lake or a pond. The electronics have held up, but the water has corroded the motors and a lot of other stuff inside the Yamato. Eventually, when fall rolled around and my attention was diverted to classes, the ship sat in my basement, untouched for the whole winter, where things started to grow inside of it, which was disgusting. So after a particularly awful class, I decided I needed a project to take my mind off of this and prep myself for the summer. So I decided that I would rebuild the Yamato. To start off with, I would need to clean the rust and weird contraptions growing inside the hull. So I took the deck off and hauled the hull outside and washed it down. While I was doing this cleaning process, I realized the hull had a few issues with it.
I suppose something I've never really thought about is how much the bottom of the ship actually gets scraped on like things like rocks and all that stuff. And it appears we have an actual damaged bit here. Actually, now that I look at it, there's a lot more cracks around where the motors are actually supposed to be. That's not a good sign.
Now, I'm not entirely sure what caused the cracks. Perhaps when I installed the motors last time I weakened the plastic. Or maybe it's something that happens with really old models that go into water decently often. Either way, it needed to be fixed. I had some goals with this Yamato, this time round, on what I wanted to add. I would address the water damage done to the ship, add some more decoration with the knowledge I've gained in the past year, and add some ease of life features to make the ship more user-friendly. With the hull cleaned and some of the defects found, I moved on to ripping out the old motors, propeller shafts, and one of the propellers, which had a lot of rust on it. But why remove the propeller shaft? When I installed them last time, I broke this bit off, and a lot of water began to pour into the hull every time I put the ship in the water. After a lot of struggling, I pulled the propeller shaft out. I must have secured them very tightly to the hull because I ended up bending some of them just to try and get them out. Next up was filling in the cracked part of the hull, which was easy enough, but more cracks were starting to form across the hull. One that was growing rather quickly was at the bow, which took a lot of filling to make it somewhat whole. Despite my efforts, the crack would persist, but to a lesser extent, it isn't an issue when running the ship. Moving on from those repairs, I wanted to give the ship a metal panel texture, similar to the smaller 1/700 Yamato that I have. To do this, I masked off long strips across the hull before adding multiple thick layers of primer over it. The end result was pretty good. I let it sit for a day or two before pulling the masking tape off to reveal the look that I wanted. With this done, I repainted the hull in the same Curie naval gray and red that the ship had been in previously, before re-adding the propeller shafts and new propellers. From here, I caulked the areas around the propeller shafts and gave the hull a float test. It did fairly well, but water continued to leak in through the propeller shafts. I tried a lot of ways to stop it, but in the end, the water always found a way in, so I would come up with a different plan for that later. Next was to add lights. Previously, I had run the ship at night, but rust had eaten away at the batteries for the superstructure, and it was a bit difficult to actually see where the ship was on the lake with just the navigation lights and the bridge lit up. So, I intended to drill out the ship's portholes and add lights in there. I was careful not to damage the hull with this, but in the end, there were a few places where I had to touch up the paint.
Alright, so I'm about to drill some holes in for the portholes, so I can put the fairy lights in here. I'm going to use the 1/700 Yamato as a more accurate example of where each porthole goes.
With help from my father, we soldered a new battery system in place with new LED lights for the superstructure, removing the old temporary system I had previously. Now it's all clean and works reliably. After more caulking to seal the portholes, I received some fairy lights and hot glued them to the inside of the hull. The end result was pretty good, and although the lights spilled out a bit with the deck installed, it kinda helps to see the ship's outline a bit more in the dark, so I don't mind.
So the second flow test, when I push the bow under, there's a small amount of water that comes trickling through at the very forward portholes there. I believe it's on the port side. And this propeller shaft is still leaking, so I'm gonna have to take all this out and then just re-caulk it. So that's gonna be fun. Another float test. We're still leaking through the port propeller shaft. I have no idea why. I'm just gonna spray more Flex Seal in there. We're going to test electronics to see if they work properly. So, rather unfortunately, the starboard side has now started to leak. On the bright side, the port side isn't leaking, so I know what I need to do to the starboard side now. But things work just fine.
Now, I had some of the motors wired in wrong for the first float test and had to go back and change it up, but now that it had new motors and it was working well, I changed gears to the deck. I was never really happy with the ship's deck. It was one of those giant wooden stickers you get, and I screwed up the placement when I originally put it on the ship, and it cracked and looked really, really bad. My temporary solution was to just paint it over with and deal it in the future. Well, the future is now, and I had a new idea for the deck. I was going to use teak veneer for the deck, though I had to remove the old deck, which was a painful process. The deck was properly stuck to the plastic, and I ended up having to shave off bits with a knife. Don't try this at home, it was incredibly dangerous, but it was the only thing I could do to remove it. With the deck stripped, I could add the veneer. This took a long time to get right, but in the end it turned out really nice. I joined the deck to the hull and superstructure, and the ship started to look really good. Next up was the metal decks. I ordered a 1/200 photo etch upgrade kit for the trumpeter Yamato, fully aware it probably wouldn't work with my much older model. But I was determined to make it work regardless, and with a lot of super glue, I eventually managed to get all the metal pieces put down. I even replaced the plastic gun barrels with metal ones, mainly so I could have the ends of the barrels in a shiny metal. After this was a bit of painting. I decided to go with a brilliant white for the fore and aft decks, mainly because I thought it looked cool. After the paint, I caulked the deck permanently to the hull to form a decent watertight hull, and with that, the ship's rebuild was complete. As part of the ease of life features for the ship, I wanted to build a launch rig for it. Lugging around 16 pounds of boat isn't especially easy when you have to launch it. My original plan was to use PVC pipe, but all of my local hardware stores didn't have what I needed on short notice. So, instead, I used this plastic shelf that my father graciously allowed me to use. Using epoxy to hold it together and the chain that was originally used for weight in the ship as a grabbing point, the launch rig was ready, and all that was left now was to sail the ship. Unfortunately, where I live, the weather hasn't been great, so finding a day to run the ship was tricky. A friend of mine graciously assisted me in the operation of the vessel, and on a day when we both had time and the lake had calmed down a bit, we put the ship in the water. For the first time in a year, the Yamato was going to run. But the lake wasn't as calm as we hoped. The waves were bumpy, and often water would crash over the second turret. The issue with that is that there are holes in the deck for the turrets to fit into. This allows them to be positioned wherever I want, but it also means that they're one of the few parts in the hull that isn't waterproof. After a little bit of running, we took the ship back in. Water was up to the motors, but the ship had survived. Finding another opportunity to run the ship was difficult. Either my friend would be available, but the water would be choppy, or my friend would be busy and the water would be clear. But a month later, and a week after my birthday, we got our chance. There was the no-wake rule applied in the evening, no wind or storm. It was a calm evening on the lake, perfect for the Yamato. I set her down into the lake, and this time she got a proper run-in. Now, to capture some of the footage, I handed my phone to a friend of mine, before handing them the controls, to allow me to record some of it. Unfortunately, the Yamato's maneuverability became a bit too much to handle for my friend as he crashed it into a floating platform. This tore the very front of the ship clean off and bent the jackstaff a fair amount back. Since the jackstaff was made of metal, it was fine, but the collision sent the chrysanthemum whirling off into the depths, never to be seen again. So the rest of the voyage was done without it and a slightly bent metal deck. Regardless, the ship performed beautifully. The only water that was in the ship was from the earlier mentioned leaking propeller shafts. I even managed to get some footage of the ship with the lights on while it became dark out. And with that, the 1/200 Yamato was reborn, refit with new parts, replacing some old ones, and despite many delays, this has been one of the most fulfilling projects that I've ever done.